Kingdoms across the continent often bragged about their warriors, their treasures, or their temples, but Orohana was known for something far stranger, something almost mythical: the king's voice. People said King Bado's voice could settle an argument before it began. It could calm a crying child, silence a raging crowd, or make an entire market stand still, without a single guard lifting a spear. Every morning at sunrise, when Bado walked out onto the palace balcony and greeted the city with a simple good morning, shopkeepers paused their hands mid-air, children stopped mid-run, and even birds seemed to rest on their wings for a moment. His voice wasn't loud or commanding. It carried a deep, quiet vibration, something warm, ancient, honest, almost like the earth itself was speaking. And because the voice was so powerful, the people trusted it. They trusted him. But on one particular morning, long after the drums of dawn had faded, King Bado woke up and felt something horribly wrong. His chest felt heavy, as if he had swallowed a stone in his sleep. His throat felt dry, but not thirsty, empty. When he tried to call for water, nothing came out. Not a whisper, not a grunt, nothing. A terrifying silence filled the room, and for the first time in generations, the king of Orohana had no voice. Within an hour, palace healers rushed through the marble corridors, herbalists carrying bowls of steaming roots, physicians with tiny jars of oil, spiritual readers with feathers and stones. Yet each one failed, one after another, leaving behind only the scent of crushed leaves and the king's widening fear. The courtyard outside began to buzz with tension. Servants whispered, guards exchanged uneasy glances, and nobles paced the corridors like restless shadows. The people of Orohana felt something was wrong long before anyone told them. Markets grew strangely quiet. Drummers missed their usual morning rhythm. And the city's storytellers found themselves unable to start a new tale because they were waiting for the king's voice to greet the day, waiting for that familiar comfort that never came. By midday, the news had begun spreading like dust on a dry wind. King Bado cannot speak. The king has lost his blessing. Something terrible has happened. Some believed it was a curse sent by forgotten ancestors. Some believed the king had fallen ill from a hidden disease. Some even whispered that an enemy kingdom had used dark knowledge to silence him. The palace corridors trembled with fear, not because kings were expected to be perfect, but because no one knew what Orohana would become without the voice that held it together. The council gathered in a quiet circle inside the Hall of Spears. Their gold robes rustled nervously, and for a long time no one dared start the conversation. Finally one noble cleared his throat and whispered, "If the king cannot speak, how long until the people panic?" Another added, "How long until someone else tries to claim the throne?" It was a kind of fear that grows in silence, heavy, shapeless, dangerous. Meanwhile, the king himself sat alone in his private chamber, surrounded by the drums and woven cloths that reminded him of his ancestors, and tried again and again to force a sound out. His lips trembled, his throat tightened, but nothing, not even the smallest breath, escaped. He wanted to tell his people he was still there, still strong, still their protector. Instead, he felt trapped inside his own body, watching the world worry about him while he could not even voice his reassurance. Outside the chamber, dozens of servants moved nervously, except for one. A young, thin water carrier named Olo kept quietly observing everything. The rushing physicians, the trembling guards, the worried glances. Unlike the others, Olo did not panic. He simply watched the king from afar, noticing the exhaustion building behind his eyes, the heaviness in his shoulders, the strange pain that seemed deeper than a missing voice. Olo had grown up listening, not speaking. His grandmother used to tell him, "The world is full of loud men, but only the quiet ones hear truth." And so he listened now, not to the king's silence, but to the silence within it. As the day stretched into afternoon, the kingdom outside began shifting in ways no one expected. At the city's edge, farmers wondered if the drought would worsen without the king's guidance. In the marketplaces, women asked each other whether prices would rise. Children tugged on their mother's clothes and asked why the palace drums had not sounded. Shops closed early. Even the river ferrymen moved slower, glancing nervously toward the palace towers. Orohana, usually loud with life, grew strangely still, as if holding its breath. Inside the palace, The royal doctors returned carrying scrolls of old knowledge, insisting the king must drink bitter mixtures, breathe smoke from burning leaves, or lie under sun-heated stones. Each ritual grew more desperate. They rubbed his throat with oils, placed charms beside his bed, sang healing melodies meant to open blocked energy. But none of it worked. Every failed attempt left the healers more frustrated and the room more tense. King Bado, exhausted and humiliated, felt his confidence slipping. How could a man whose voice once softened storms now sit hopelessly voiceless in front of his own people? A strange thought crept into his mind, one he refused to believe. What if the silence was not in his throat, but in his heart? He pushed the idea away, yet it hovered like a shadow behind him. And just then, into this hall of fear and frustration, Olo stepped forward, quietly, hesitantly, carrying his wooden bucket of water as he always did. He wasn't meant to speak. He wasn't meant to stand near nobles. He certainly wasn't meant to offer opinions in a hall full of royal healers. But something inside him, perhaps his grandmother's voice, perhaps something deeper, pushed him forward. He looked straight at the silent king and felt a truth rise in him like a tide. It frightened him, but it felt real. By evening, tension began to feel like a heavy fog hanging over the palace. The council prepared for the worst. Secret meetings, frightened whispers, predictions of unrest. Torches flickered along the stone walls as the sun dipped below the horizon, and the palace gardens filled with long shadows that swayed like restless spirits. The king stood on his balcony, staring at the city he loved but could no longer address. For the first time in years, he felt unsure of himself, unsure if he had lost something more important than a voice. Down below in the courtyard, Olo wiped his hands on his worn tunic, took a deep breath, and made a decision that could either save him or end him. He stepped toward the palace steps, walked past guards who barely noticed him, and moved toward the silent king with a courage he didn't know he had. When he finally spoke, his voice shook, but his words carried a strange clarity. "Your Majesty, I don't think your voice is lost. I think your heart is carrying a weight you haven't faced." Several nobles turned sharply, ready to silence him, but by then the words had already been spoken. For a brief, suspended moment, every torch in the courtyard seemed to flicker at the same time, as if the entire kingdom had paused to listen. And though the king still could not speak, something in his eyes shifted, something that hinted faintly that Olo's words might be the first true thing anyone had said all day. For a long, uneasy heartbeat, the courtyard remained suspended in silence after Olo's trembling words drifted into the night air. The nobles were stunned, some offended, some furious, some simply confused that a servant, a water carrier, had dared speak in the presence of the king without permission. But King Bado, standing motionless on his balcony with the fading sunset behind him, did not gesture for Olo to be removed, nor did he show even a flicker of anger. Instead, something in his expression softened, just slightly, as if Olo had reached a part of him no healer or scholar had managed to touch. When the guards finally reacted and stepped forward to grab Olo's arm, Bado lifted one hand, slowly, deliberately, and the guards froze in place. Even without a voice, the king still had command in his eyes. He descended the stone steps toward Olo, his robe whispering across the ground, and stopped only a few feet away from a young servant. His breath was strained, his chest rising and falling with a quiet ache, but he looked at Olo with a strange mixture of exhaustion, curiosity, and hope. No one in the courtyard had ever seen that expression on their king before. Olo swallowed hard, afraid he had overstepped beyond forgiveness, yet something inside him urged him to finish what he had started. "My grandmother used to say," he whispered, "that when a leader stops hearing the truth of his people, the world takes his voice so he can learn to listen again." Several nobles scoffed, their gold wrist cuffs clinking sharply in the silence, but Olo didn't look at them. He kept his eyes on the king, steady despite the tremble in his hands. And in that quiet courtyard, the same courtyard that had once echoed with the king's powerful morning greetings, King Bado lowered his gaze, not in shame, but in something deeper, something like acceptance. For the first time all day, he felt he was not trapped by silence. He was being given a message through it, a message he had avoided for years. The next morning arrived with a heavy, gray sky hanging low over Orohana, as though the heavens themselves sensed a shift that had begun within the palace. Word had already spread that the mute king had allowed a servant to speak directly to him, and people whispered about it behind closed doors and beside cooking fires. Some found it laughable, some found it alarming, but many, surprisingly many, found it comforting. If the king was willing to listen to someone as small as a water carrier, perhaps he was beginning to understand the kingdom's grief. Inside the palace, however, the atmosphere was tense and uncertain. The council demanded an emergency meeting, insisting that allowing servants to speak freely would lead to chaos, but King Bado walked past them without responding, ignoring their frustrated murmurs and tapping staffs. He didn't go to the healer's chambers. He didn't go to the council hall. Instead, he walked into the servant quarters, surprising everyone. Olo, who had barely slept after the previous night's events, rushed to stand, but the king raised a hand for him to stay seated. Without a word, he gestured for Olo to follow him, and so the kingdom witnessed something no one in generations had seen. The king of Orohana walking to the lower corridors beside a servant as equals. Some guards stared in confusion. Others exchanged whispers, but Olo focused on the king's silent breathing. The heaviness mixed with determination. When they stepped out of the palace gate, the city held its breath. The king had not walked its streets in years. He usually traveled with drums, banners, and guards. But today, there were no trumpets, no ceremonial escorts. Only the king in a plain robe and a thin servant at his side, moving through the dusty roads like two men seeking something neither fully understood yet. At first, people backed away, unsure if they were allowed to approach. Mothers grabbed their children and bowed. Elderly men bent low, afraid to meet the king's eyes. But Olo stepped forward and gently encouraged them. "Speak. If you wish, he is here to hear you." The first to approach was a farmer with cracked hands and tired eyes who had lost 2 seasons of crops to drought. Next came a young mother whose son had been turned away from the healer house because she couldn't pay the extra fees a greedy attendant had added. Then an old warrior, limping with age, confessed he felt forgotten by the palace he once fought for. As each person spoke, something remarkable happened, not to them, but to Bado. His silence changed shape. It was no longer the silence of helplessness. It became the silence of receiving, the silence of confrontation, the silence of man finally hearing all the things he had unknowingly ignored. Olo watched closely, noticing every shift. The way Bado's hands tightened when someone described hardship, the way his shoulders slumped when a child talked of hunger, the way he blinked too fast when an old merchant spoke of losing hope. And yet, despite all this emotional weight, the king kept listening hour after hour, walking street after street. By noon, he looked exhausted, but he refused to stop. Something inside him had begun to unwind, like a knot that had been tightening for years, finally softening its grip. As the sun dipped lower and the heat softened, Olo led the king toward the oldest part of Orohana, where narrow mud brick houses leaned gently toward each other, and the air smelled of dried herbs and with smoke. Here lived the people no council report ever mentioned, the nameless, the voiceless, the forgotten. Many of them froze when they saw the king approaching, unsure how a man of gold and silk could step into their aging streets. But Olo's calm, steady presence reassured them. The king sat down with a group of tired fishermen who had lost their boats to a storm. He knelt beside a little girl who clutched a broken toy and whispered, "My father says the palace doesn't see us anymore." He listened to a blind woman who spoke softly about rising prices, and to a widow who explained how loneliness had swallowed her since the death of her husband. None of these stories were dramatic. They were not tragedies meant for royal scrolls. They were simply the hidden bruises of a kingdom, small hurts carried for so long that they had become invisible until now. By the time twilight settled across the rooftops, King Bado's face had changed entirely. His silence was no longer confused or fearful. It was filled with understanding. And then Olo guided him to one final home, a tiny hut made of reed and clay, where an elderly woman sat stirring a pot of thin soup. She lifted her head slowly when she sensed their presence. Her eyes were cloudy, her hands trembling, but her voice steady when she spoke. "Your Majesty," she said, "we were never angry with you. We only wish you would walk among us again." The king's breath hitched, and his knees gave slightly, not out of weakness, but out of a wave of emotion so deep it hollowed him. The old woman touched his wrist and whispered, A king is not a king when he stands above his people, but when he stands with them. And in that moment, something ancient and unseen shifted inside his chest. A warmth rose from beneath his ribs, a pressure dissolved from his throat. And though he did not speak yet, his eyes glistened with the realization that perhaps Olo, this quiet servant, had been right all along. Healing did not come from herbs or chance. It came from truth finally received. For several long seconds after the elderly woman's words settled into night air, King Bado stood frozen, his breath uneven, his eyes blurred with tears. He refused to blink away, as though blinking might shatter the fragile truth he had just received. Olo watched him quietly, sensing that this moment was more than a simple meeting. It was the unraveling of years of spiritual weight, a burden the king had carried without ever acknowledging it. The fog of guilt, long buried beneath royal obligations and ceremonial duties, now rose like dust from floor that had not been swept in too long. The king lowered himself to the ground beside the old woman's fire, his knees trembling not from physical exhaustion, but from the emotional gravity pressing inward like a tightening drum. The widow continued stirring her thin soup, her hands moving slowly, rhythmically, as if her motion alone held a fragile world together. Children from neighboring huts emerged, drawn by the rare sight of their king sitting in their dusty courtyard without guards or golden staffs, and they hovered silently nearby, unsure they were allowed to breathe too loudly. The king looked into their faces, thin cheeks, hopeful eyes, quiet smiles that carried more resilience than most grown men possessed, and a realization pierced him. He had been ruling from atop a mountain, while the strength of Orohana lived here, in the quiet homes he had not visited in far too long. The old woman placed a hand on his arm, and the simple, human warmth of her touch broke open a dam inside him. Tears slid down his face, falling freely into the dust, and suddenly the silence he'd been trapped in for days didn't feel like a punishment anymore. It felt like a cleansing, a necessary stillness given to him so he could finally see what he had failed to hear. The woman's voice, cracked yet steady, whispered again, "Your people do not need perfection. They need presence. They need a king whose ears reach further than his throne." And as she spoke, King Bado felt an unmistakable stirring deep within his chest. A gentle vibration, not yet a voice, but a promise that something inside him was beginning to reopen. Before he could process it, a distant shout echoed from the far edge of the settlement where two nobles had followed in hopes of dragging the king back to the palace. Their expressions carried anger, fear, and something uglier, threatened pride. They stormed forward, scolding the villagers for speaking to the king informally, accusing Olo of misguiding his majesty, demanding that the king return to the palace where order, not chaos, governed. The king's hands clenched, and even without a voice, the disapproval in his eyes struck the nobles like a slap. He rose slowly, the children backing away, and pointed firmly to the ground as if declaring, "This is where I belong tonight." Then he turned to Olo, this thin servant with his worn sandals and steady gaze, and nodded once, in a way that carried the weight of a royal decree. Olo understood instantly. The king wanted to hear more. And so, as the moon climbed higher, Olo led him deeper into the narrow alleys where, one by one, villagers stepped forward. A potter afraid of losing her craft to cheap imports, a teacher who felt powerless as more children dropped out of school to work, an old man who sold carved flutes but hadn't had a buyer in months. With every story, the king's shoulders loosened, his breath grew steadier, and his silence shifted from wounded to reflective. The nobles followed reluctantly, forced to watch their king find truth in places they had spent years ignoring. By the time Olo guided King Bado back toward the heart of the kingdom, hours had passed, but the king walked lighter, almost as if the dust beneath his feet recognized a change in him. The night felt warmer, the shadows softer, and though he still could not speak, Olo sensed that the king's silence was reaching its final pages. Orohana was beginning to breathe through him again. When dawn finally approached, pale gold brushing the tops of the clay rooftops, King Bado and Olo stepped onto a hill overlooking the entire city, a hill the king had not climbed since his youth, when he would sneak away from his lessons, simply to watch people wake and stretch and begin their humble morning routines. Now he stood there again, older, wiser, scarred by leadership yet softened by truth, watching as the kingdom slowly lit with life. The soft thrum of drums, the bark of traders opening their stalls, the clatter of clay pots. Each sound stirred something familiar in his throat. A warmth spread upward, like embers in a long-abandoned fire, catching their first breath of air. Olo noticed a shift and quietly stepped behind him, allowing the king his moment without interruption. The breeze carried children's laughter from distant alleys, and it shook loose memories the king had tried to forget. Memories of his father walking among the people, his mother speaking gently to the sick, the early days when the palace was not a fortress but a gathering place. Suddenly, it hit him with almost painful clarity. He had lost his voice long before the morning it disappeared. The world had simply removed the last echo to force him to notice. As this realization washed over him, the weight he had carried for years, fear of failure, pressure of expectations, the loneliness of command, seemed to slide out of his body like chains falling from weary wrists. His breath trembled, his throat stirred again, and this time Olo saw the king's hand fly to his chest as if something inside him had cracked open. A faint sound escaped, raw, shaky, small, but unmistakably a sound. The king's eyes widened. Another sound followed, this time more stable, and then another until the air vibrated with the fragile beginnings of a voice reborn. He looked at Olo with childlike shock, as though the world had handed him a miracle he had never dared to ask for. Olo didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply bowed his head, honoring the sacredness of the moment, understanding that a voice is not truly returned through magic or medicine, but through awakening. When King Bado finally managed to speak a full word, just one, his entire body shook with emotion. "Thank," it broke halfway, but the attempt alone sent a ripple of hope across the silent morning. Birds took flight. The city dogs perked their ears. Even the breeze seemed to hush, as though bowing to the moment. Olo steadied him as the king exhaled shakily, tears spilling freely down his cheeks, not for the voice itself, but for the journey he had needed to reclaim it. And somewhere, far behind them, hidden in the palace corridors, a jealous noble named Jama watched the rising sun with clenched fists, realizing that all his whispered plans and quiet manipulations were slipping away. The king's voice, once lost, was returning, and with it, the kingdom's power to see through lies. But forgiveness, Tamo realized, does not arrive like a sudden burst of sunlight breaking through a storm. It comes slowly, hesitantly, like a shy guest standing at the doorway, unsure of its welcome. As he sat beside the recovering king, feeling the quiet weight of dawn pressing softly through the palace windows, Tamo found himself battling two truths at once: his father's unbearable death and the king's equally unbearable grief. Both men had been wounded by the same lie, the same betrayal, the same hidden rot that had been poisoning the kingdom from within. Tamo did not speak for a long time. King Orohana didn't either. The silence stretched between them, not sharp anymore, but tired, like two old warriors finally laying down their weapons. Only when the first stirrings of palace life echoed from the courtyard did Tamo finally draw a breath and say, almost in a whisper, "I don't know how to forgive yet, but I don't hate you anymore." The king turned his head very slowly, his eyes clouded but warm, as if those words had touched a wound he didn't realize was still bleeding. "That is enough, Tamo," he murmured. "Forgiveness is not a door that opens at once. Sometimes it is a path, and sometimes it is enough simply to walk in the right direction." Tamo didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at the king, not as a ruler, not as a target of revenge, not even as a man he had once feared, but as a human being who had carried guilt not born of his own hands. And in that strange, fragile moment, Tamo felt his anger loosen slightly, like a tightly knotted rope beginning to fray. The palace physicians arrived soon after with gentle steps and respectful bows, urging the king to rest and guiding Tamo outside the chamber. But when the heavy doors closed behind him, Tamo did not feel pushed away. He felt, unexpectedly, entrusted. He walked down the long, polished hallway, past paintings of kings and queens, past towering pillars carved with the kingdom's history, and he realized that for the first time in his life, none of this grandeur made him feel small. He felt necessary. He felt part of something greater than himself. He felt chosen, and that realization both warmed and frightened him. Outside, the sun was already climbing the sky, gilding the stone courtyards with its steady glow. Servants hurried past, guards changed shifts, scribes carried scrolls to and from the council chambers. But Tamo moved differently, slower, deeper in thought. The truth had changed him. The king's honesty had softened him, and now, like a man waking from a dream only to find another dream waiting, Tamo felt the first tug of responsibility. If the king was innocent, then the true betrayer was still somewhere within the walls of this palace. Someone who had killed his father. Someone who had tried to kill the king. Someone who had almost succeeded. As he stepped outside into the long walkway overlooking the training grounds, Tamo knew one thing with absolute clarity. He could not walk away. Not now. Not after everything he had learned. The truth demanded more from him. Justice demanded more from him. His father's memory demanded more from him. And so, standing above the open grounds where soldiers trained and servants carried their daily burdens, Tamo finally made a decision. Not out of rage, not out of pain, but out of a quiet, steady resolve. He would stay. He would uncover the true traitor. He would protect King Orohana, not because the king had begged him to, not because he felt indebted, but because it was right. Because for the first time in years, he felt he had a purpose that wasn't rooted in loss. "Father," he whispered under his breath, "I think I can finally understand what I need to do." And as if the wind itself answered, a soft breeze swept across the courtyard, brushing against his face like a blessing. That very evening, the palace shifted around Tamo in subtle ways, as though the walls themselves sensed a new intention rising within him. Word spread quickly among the guards and servants that the king's mysterious young savior had not left the castle. Some whispered that Tamo had become the king's new confidant. Others whispered the opposite, that Tamo was a threat the king was too weak to see. But Tamo ignored the murmurs. He had no interest in palace rumor or politics. His focus rested solely on uncovering the hidden roots of betrayal, and he began by observing the palace with fresh eyes. Every corridor, every servant expression, every guard's hesitation, every council member's overly polite smile. He noticed all of it. The more he watched, the clearer it became that beneath the polished floors and grand architecture, a quiet tension pulsed through the castle, like an undiscovered crack beneath the foundation. That night, the council met behind closed doors for the first time since the king's poisoning. Tamo stood at a distance, half hidden behind a stone archway, watching the high-ranking ministers enter the chamber one by one. Their expressions were stiff, unreadable, but Tamo sensed an unnatural urgency in their movements, especially from Minister Coven, the king's ambitious and sharp-tongued advisor. Tamo had seen Coven only a few times before, but something about the man's confident stride and overly careful smiles unsettled him. Coven carried the air of someone who always expected doors to open for him. The kind of man who spoke in polite words but kept his true thoughts tucked behind his ribs like a concealed weapon. And when he paused at the doorway, glancing back over his shoulder as though wary of being watched, Tamo felt a cold pulse of suspicion ripple through him. As the heavy council doors shut, muffling the voices inside, Tamo slipped away into shadows, his mind working rapidly. If someone within the palace had orchestrated the king's poisoning, that person would be eager to shape the narrative now, to use the crisis to their advantage, to bend fear into opportunity. Tamo wandered past the torchlit hallways and down the grand staircase toward the Queen's old library, a quiet place that few visited anymore. He sat between towering shelves of ancient scrolls, breathing in the dust of forgotten histories, and let his thoughts unravel. His father had been a humble servant. Who would want him dead? Someone who feared what he had overheard, something he had discovered, something he had carried. And then, with a sudden, almost frightening clarity, Tamo realized his father had worked closely with palace records. He had handled documents. He had cleaned council chambers after private meetings. He had likely heard things meant to remain buried. Tamo's heart pounded as the truth blossomed painfully in his mind. His father hadn't died because he was weak or unlucky. He had died because he had known something dangerous, something worth killing for. And because King Orohana had trusted his father, the traitor had marked them both as threats. The motives aligned too sharply to be coincidence. Someone in the council was orchestrating everything. Someone who now sat in that chamber only a few floors above him, pretending loyalty while carrying poison in their words and ambition in their veins. Tamo stood slowly, his hands trembling, but his resolve hardening. He knew now that the danger was not over. If anything, It had only just begun. The king was still vulnerable. The kingdom was still in the hands of men who might already be plotting the next strike. And Tamo understood deeply instinctively that he could not remain a bystander. His father's truth, the king's survival, his own future. Tamo moved to the corridors like a man awakened, each step heavier with the realization that his father's death had not been fate, but murder, deliberate, calculated, and woven into the highest levels of the palace. That knowledge pressed against his ribs like a second heartbeat as he climbed the long staircase toward the upper chambers where the council meeting was taking place. The torches flickered restlessly, casting tall, trembling shadows along the walls, almost as if the castle itself sensed the shifting tides within it. Tamo paused at a corner, listening. From behind the carved wooden doors of the council chamber came the muffled cadence of voices, some tense, some too calm. He could not distinguish individual words, but the tone carried unmistakable urgency. Someone in that room knew exactly what had happened. Someone in that room had set everything in motion, and as Tamo pressed his palm against the cool stone wall, steadying himself, he felt the weight of a new understanding. If his father had died for a secret, then the same secret still threatened the king, the kingdom, and now him. The thought didn't frighten him the way it might have days ago. Instead, it stoked something inside him, something sharp and unwavering. Loss had shaped him, anger had driven him, but truth had reshaped him entirely. When the chamber doors finally opened and the minister began to spill out, Tamo kept to the shadows, observing the subtlest movements, the smallest nervous glances, the stiffness in their shoulders. Most of them left quickly, retreating toward their private quarters with anxious whispers threading between them. But Minister Coven lingered behind, his footsteps slow, deliberate, as though he carried the gravity of the kingdom's future in each stride. Tamo watched him walk down the hallway, and with every step Coven took, Tamo felt his suspicion sharpen into something dangerously close to certainty. There was a cold precision in Coven's eyes, a steady calm that didn't match the chaos unfolding around the king. A man who cared deeply would have shown fear. But Coven's face was unreadable, almost rehearsed. Tamo followed at a careful distance as the minister turned a corner and moved into a dimly lit passageway rarely used except by palace staff. Coven's pace quickened. He glanced behind him once, twice, each time reassuring himself that he was alone. Tamo's breath caught. This was not the path to the council rooms. It was a passageway leading toward the old storage chambers, where the palace records were kept, including the ones Tamo's father had once maintained. And in that instant, everything aligned with chilling clarity. The man who walked before him was not merely ambitious. He was hiding something, protecting something, or destroying something. Tamo stepped out before Coven fully realized he was being followed. The minister froze, his eyes narrowing, his hand instinctively brushing the pocket of his robe, where something small and metallic shifted. For a brief moment, neither spoke. The hallway held its breath. Then Coven smiled, a thin, brittle smile that cracked at the edges. "The king seems quite fond of you," he said softly, his voice smooth as dark oil. A remarkable rise for a servant. Tamo didn't respond. He simply stared, his silence more dangerous than any accusation. Coven continued, "But you must understand the kingdom is delicate, and delicate things require strong hands, loyal hands." Tamo stepped closer. "My father was loyal," he said quietly, "and he died for it." Coven's expression flickered, just for a heartbeat, but that brief, uncontrollable twitch was enough. Tamo saw the truth carved into it like a confession. "Your father," Coven murmured, regaining his composure, stumbled into matters he could not comprehend. Tamo felt the rage he thought he'd shed begin to rise again, but he mastered it, letting the anger settle into a colder, steadier place. "He comprehended enough to die," Tamo replied. "And so did the king, almost." That was when Coven's mask finally cracked. His hand slipped into his robe. Tamo lunged, instinct overriding thought, and the world exploded into motion. The struggle was fierce, desperate, and silent. Two men locked in combat not for glory but for truth. When they crashed into the stone floor, a small glass vial rolled across the ground, its dark contents catching the torchlight. Poison. The same poison used on the king. The same poison that killed Tamo's father. And in that moment, the last thread of doubt snapped. Coven scrambled for the vial, but Tamo seized his wrist, forcing him back against the wall. The minister's composure shattered. "You don't understand," he hissed, his voice trembling for the first time. "The king is weak. He listens to fools. He would drag this kingdom into ruin." Tamo tightened his grip. "So you kill my father?" Coven's eyes darkened. "Your father heard what he shouldn't have. He overheard the king's refusal to expand the council's power. He overheard my plans. He became a liability. And the king, well, the kingdom needed a stronger hand." Every word twisted like a blade inside Tamo's chest. Not because of its cruelty, but because of how easily Coven believed himself justified. Before Tamo could respond, the sound of armored footsteps echoed down the corridor. Guards rounded the corner, torches blazing, drawn by the commotion. In seconds, Coven was restrained, his furious protests swallowed by the clatter of metal as the guards dragged him away. Tamo stood motionless, breathing hard, the smell of dust and torch smoke thick in the air. A guard approached him and bowed slightly. "The king has woken," he said. "He has been asking for you." Tamo nodded, still trembling from the weight of what had just unfolded. When he entered the king's chamber, King Orohana looked frail but alert, his eyes searching Tamo's face with quiet urgency. "It is finished," Tamo whispered. "The traitor is found." The king exhaled, not in relief but in sorrow. "No victory against treachery is ever clean," he murmured. "But you have saved not only me, you have saved the kingdom." Tamo lowered his head. "I only did what was right." The king gestured weakly for him to come closer. "No, Tamo," he said gently. "You did what only a man of great courage could do." And as Tamo stood beside the king's bed, the weight of his father's memory resting softly on his shoulders rather than crushing them, he understood something he never expected to. His revenge had led him to truth, but truth had led him to purpose. The kingdom did not see him as a servant anymore, and for the first time in his life, he did not see himself as one either. He saw himself as someone who could protect, someone who could lead, someone who could carry a legacy not built on pain, but on justice. Outside, dawn was breaking once more, the same dawn that had witnessed his first steps away from hatred. But now, as its warm light spilled into the room, Tamo felt something settle deep within him. A quiet, unwavering sense of who he had become. A son who honored his father. A man who had faced the truth. And a protector who had chosen the harder path not out of anger, but out of courage.